Hi, class. Welcome to the end of the semester. If we were in class together, we would have a round of applause for our graduates, Brianna and any others. So feel free to share your plans on the discussion boards if you haven't done so already. And please find me at graduation and say hello. So we are ending our whirlwind journey from the roots of sociological theory that were coming at us from the beginning years of our discipline through to the current day into Afrofuturism and into the future with all of your stories. If you started the semester with theory phobia, as some students do, I hope the semesters help to melt some of those barriers for you. The scholars who spend their entire careers studying and creating theory do have a special skill, a special stock of knowledge that not everyone has. But that doesn't mean that students and non-theorists can't critically engage with their ideas and understand their ideas and find possible applications, which I hope you have kind of practiced the skill of doing that this semester. I think that's something that will be useful to you as you move forward in whatever you do next. Also, we have the power to speak back to the theorists when there are blind spots or historical changes that have happened since they were on this earth. So remember that to empower you to engage with theories. I'm enjoying your short stories. Um, just a little whirlwind review of what you've been reading from each other. And if we were in class, we would get to hear them read to us. Adriana transports us into the head of a character of a perfect modern industrialized city who has to escape to see its downsides and how it affects the individual. The sociologist Georg Simmel, who is no longer with us, but he wrote about this in his essay, The Metropolis and Mental Life, which is the strain that urban life places on people. And he was writing during the early years of urbanization and industrialization. Jessica uses the octopus relationships to portray the way we're stuck in our culture thinking that we have it all. And Elena's story of the two sisters is also a wake up call, as the new sister is like a mirror to the one who thinks she has it all. Tangela gives us a glimpse at societal surveillance as the main character learns that they are being broadcast across airport television screens. And Jennifer Neely also picks up on that surveillance in the school setting where the knowledge of being watched affects the students' performance. So they can't figure out what is real. And Amanda's story gives us the more intentional performance in front of a camera for a social media audience and how staged the persona is. I guess to some extent that's kind of what I'm doing right now. Ryan introduces us to Shakespeare Speedway, which might mirror any of your lives if you've ever worked in customer service, whether Speedway or somewhere else. Jemiah portrays a status system that can be an allegory of our immigration laws. Tori takes us to another planet where there are two different populations that collaborate using specialized tasks in a Durkheimian way, having to rebuild after the Earth aliens attack them. And so we all become aliens in that situation, right? The Earthlings become the aliens. Chardonnay transports us into the future where Zuri is trying to increase her daily score that the algorithm gives her, but it's pushing her to be the opposite of her true self. And Tori has invented a sentient dog whose devotion does him in eventually, the oppressed class. Ashland's less violent version of the Hunger Games ends with an interesting question. Again, getting at the surveillance issue. If being real is what they wanted, was that part of the performance too? Lots of things to think about there. Kia gives us the persona of Blaise Amour. His mother molds her into an idealized status seeker that separates her from her real self. Amarian combines the ideas of Mary Wollstonecraft with the Black Swan to give us the diaries of a beauty queen contestant in the world of perfect feminine beauty standards. Sophie's wristband pulse ledger sounds similar to the facet that McKenna wrote about, monitoring everyone's performance. And the characters wake up and notice how they're being controlled or exploited, and they go back to being their real selves. Brianna writes about the microchip being put in everyone's arm when they turn 18 to make sure they go to work. And in Praise's story, people are born with different colored glows on their wrists that determine where they live and what opportunities they get, but they become conscious of this and rebel against it. So, in several of these scenarios, we see sort of the real human breaking out and becoming aware, right? Becoming conscious of how they're trapped. Jalen uses the stratified cars on a train as a metaphor for our class system. And since I recently rode a train with the different levels, it had the coach, the business, the sleeper, and the luxury sleeper. It really tracks. So if you can excuse the pun. And Olivia Probst also paints a story of our class divides in the story about the factory and the shiny building where the owners live across the street, or the owners work, work in quotation marks, across the street. And in Alexa's story, we're already born into these categories labeled levels. So this seemed to be a similar theme about some of the stories. Macaria gives us a utopic ending, like several of your stories. The oppressed and resource poor Whispering Willows are able to convince the citizens of Weeping Waters to rise up against the superiors. Zakia paints a dystopic world where the normal structures have disappeared, a sense of anomie, the opposite of the more utopian ideas in some of these stories. In a way, Zakia's story has a resemblance to The Comet, I think, where things go back to the normal in the end, but not necessarily in a utopic way. And Layla introduces us to the cybermaid Sarah, who is starting to suffer from sexism and ageism, even within the cyber world. I keep picturing Sarah in my mind, and maybe that's because I grew up with the Jetsons on Saturday morning cartoon TV. There seems to be a repeated theme here about the dystopian future of technology and how it alienates us from our true, more human selves. I think we all can relate to that. And so, thank you so much for all of these stories. I've been thinking about whether we could ever have a sitcom that's a speculative fiction scenario like these. So I was listening to some interviews with some people who are scholars of sitcoms, and which has disappeared basically. I remember when these were so common, everybody would tune in the same night to watch whatever the sitcom was. At one point it was I Love Lucy, Leave It to Beaver. Then later on we had Friends and Cheers and Seinfeld, and we could go on and on. And that world has kind of disappeared with all the streaming services and other things. But I was thinking about how there's never been a situation comedy that I can think of that was more of this science fiction type of thing, because what we had when I was a kid was The Twilight Zone, and I highly recommend you look up some of those episodes. They're very dystopian. One of them, I remember the film star Robert Redford was young, maybe one of his first roles, and he wakes up in a house where he had stayed overnight, and a woman had basically removed his feet. And there are also stories about these alternative other worlds that people's some kind of double world that they find themselves in. And the other speculative fiction, very famous one, is Star Trek, of course, but it's also not a comedy. But when I think about the sitcoms, in a way, some of them were speculative in terms of in a more optimistic way. So several of these really portrayed women in a more progressive role than most actually had at the time when they were being filmed. So I Love Lucy was one of those where she was a very typical homemaker without a job, but she was also always pushing the boundaries against that and trying to be be somebody else who, of course, her, the actress who Lucille Ball, who's playing her, actually is a studio executive, in fact. I would love for you to think about sending us your story to The Lookout, which is a publication of student work, student writings, and artistic work, creative work. So I'll send you the information about that. I know the editor for that, and I can tell her to be on the lookout, so to speak, for your stories to The Lookout. And back to theory for a little bit. I hope that among other takeaways from this semester, that you've broadened your theoretical toolkits beyond some of these standard sort of sociological theories like conflict theory, structural functionalism, symbolic interactionism. As we learned this semester, there's actually a broad range of theories out there, and each subfield within sociology has its own theories, which get applied to empirical research questions they ask. So crime and deviance have their own set of theories. Gender has its own set of theories. Fields like healthcare sociology, aging, all of these have their own sets of theories. And so it's a huge, broad world out there. So we have really just touched on some of the basics. So I hope you think about how broad sociological theory is. For example, we learned about collective memory theory, which actually is not only used in sociology, it's also used in other people in other fields like history, anthropology, and others. I was excited to introduce you to collective memory theory because I use this in a number of my research projects, as I have mentioned. My first major project, which was my PhD dissertation, was the study of the New York African Burial Ground, which I've mentioned, and I used that theory for that dissertation. I've also researched the ways that Eastern Europeans remember the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of authoritarian communist systems. And I'm currently writing about how the protest music in that movement, in the Polish Solidarity movement, used memory, and how that music is remembered now as a way of remembering the movement. I appreciate some of your reflections on how you're thinking of museums differently after reading Audrey's book. In my research that I'm doing right now on civil rights museums, I'm also asking similar questions about what's included, what perspectives are being presented or left out. And I'm actually finding some quite honest histories, including the history of lynchings and other very, very difficult aspects of our past that these museums are at least presently presenting. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. But I encourage you to visit a place called Somerset Place, which is near Edenton, if you get a chance. It is a former plantation, and a Black woman from New York traced her lineage to the enslaved population there and came down years back and worked on creating a guided tour. And it starts the visitor in the cabins where the enslaved lived, and it introduces you to their stories before you go to the big house and then hear the stories of the owners of the plantation. I found it very informative, but also emotionally compelling, the way that you start with the stories that are not about the rich owners. So a lot to think about in that tour. I also wanted to mention the intersectionality that we've talked about has been important to my research about immigrant women and how there are multiple social locations that they inhabit. So their gender, their nationality, their culture, their immigration status, and family immigration status, their race or skin tone, and social class. And this is something that is in the news right now as we're watching what's happening with immigration raids. So one example of this, the way that these intersections work, is immigrants from richer countries that are predominantly white often are called expats or expatriates rather than immigrants, for people who are from less rich countries who are not predominantly white are often called immigrants. So think about just how our language is reproducing a kind of status hierarchy. I want to encourage you to continue to notice sociological themes in popular culture, including speculative fiction and beyond. We learned how Afrofuturism has ties to sociologists, right, to scholars like W.B. Du Bois, but it's also getting created in these more public arenas like film, music, and fiction writing today. I hope you'll continue to think about that. I hope that one takeaway from this semester, whether you remain in the field of sociology or not, is that theory is useful. It's not buried in dusty old books only. It can be applied to all kinds of learning about our social world. So, with that, I want to wish you a happy end of the semester, happy end of the school year, happy graduation for some of you, and please stay in touch. Thank you for a great semester.